Hello everyone, welcome back to the project. This is already part 22, and to start, I'm gonna show you a few things about baking simulations. I talked about it briefly in the previous lesson, but I'm gonna go a bit deeper into the baking part of simulations. So by default, when you have a scene like that, Blender will affect or choose for you a cache folder, like we said earlier. If the scene is not saved, it's gonna just go into your user data on your C drive usually. And so, at the moment, its type is set to replay, meaning that the calculation will only take place if I set my timeline to the first frame of the calculation, which is frame 1, and it will end when it will end at frame 250 by default, but I can just stop the play and it's not gonna calculate what's left, but you've got what's at the beginning calculated, okay? But now if I change the settings, you see it's back to having no cached simulation, and if I play from the frame 133, it doesn't calculate anything. I really have to go back to the first frame of the calculation range, meaning frame 1 here, okay? And then you can switch to type all, meaning this will bake everything from the simulation. So let's click on all. You can see it's going much faster because it's only calculating the simulation and not playing the scene. But what you can see now that the baking is done, all the parameters are grayed out, meaning that now you can't anymore change the parameters. You would have to delete all the cache, clicking on free all if you want to change again the parameters, but that's a good way to do before you start rendering, because now you don't have to worry about recalculating the cache or the simulation and having it messed up if you just play by accident the timeline. Okay? So I would recommend you to bake all your simulations like that before we do a render of the scene. For the rendering part, I'm gonna use sequence 7. So we've already seen it before. It's the moment when we go closer to the cauldron and then the fire just starts like that. Okay, so I've set up normally all the settings necessary, and what I'm gonna do now, in fact, is, as I explained earlier, select my smoke domain, and this is the time when you can set up a resolution subdivision higher than what you use for the preview or for your tests, and I can go and change the cache type to all and bake all my simulation. It will of course take a bit of time because this is a complex simulation. Okay, so now the bake is finished. Okay, and I have the feeling it just goes a bit all over the place. I'm not sure why, maybe I need to change a few settings, but never mind. We'll proceed with that. Okay, so now let's talk about the render settings. The two tabs where you will change them are the second and third tab here in the property panel. The first one is dedicated to tools that we have also here. It's the same settings that you can have in here. It can be more convenient for some people. Okay. So the first one is here. We've already set a few of these settings, meaning switching from EV to cycles. And if your computer can handle it, it's better to switch on GPU compute because it's much faster than your CPU. Okay? Then below that, you've got two main settings, the sampling settings. One is for the viewports and one is for the render. Okay, I'm gonna only talked about one because the settings are similar. You've got here the noise threshold, meaning that if you got an amount of noise lower than this value, Blender will keep on casting rays to calculate or improve the area. And if it's higher than this value, meaning there is less noise, it will stop or at least cast less rays. Okay? These are the sample counts, so I'm sure you've seen how now the render is proceeding. You got like some kind of points, and these are the sample, and the more you have, the nicer is your render. Of course, the more you have, and the longer it takes. Okay, so you can set that to have like a minimum sample and a maximum sample, meaning that it won't stop before it reaches the minimum samples, and it will stop once it has reached the max samples. Okay, and then you also can set a time limit here, meaning that if the render takes more than 5 seconds, it will stop the rendering process. So this way, with the way now Blender works or calculates final images, you can stop a render after like 1 second. The result will not look great, but you can still do it. Okay? And then the denoise options, I usually leave all those things by default, but know that when you have like here, okay, you can have like here a lot of noise, then what the denoise option does is that it will try to smooth this area so that you don't see the noise, but then of course it is a trade-off between the absence of noise and then the final quality of your image, because if there is too much noise, the denoising will work, of course, but it will look like the area has been smudged or blurred. Okay, so it's working, but of course it's not like a magic solution. Okay, so those are the settings. You can here use presets or create your own. You can just click here, enter a name, and click then on the plus sign. And if you want to remove a preset, you've got the minus sign beside them. Okay, and a bit below, you've got also a section called light path. Okay, this allows you to select here the max bounces, meaning that the light, of course, when it is sent at the rays, bounce here on the floor, bounce here on the cauldron, and then bounce around the scene. Okay, and then you can set a max bounce, meaning the more bounce you have, the nicer your render will look, but of course it is a trade again with performance and then rendering time. So the total here amounts might be at least as high as the highest value below, and this is just so that you can set a max quality for each type of ray bounces. You've got diffuse, okay, which is about displaying the color of an object. You've got glossy, which is about reflections. Transmission, if you remember, we use the transmission parameter in our shader to make object transparent like glass. Volume, so volume, I haven't talked to you about that, but maybe I can do it now. It's subtle, but here you can see that there is atmospheric lighting. Okay, it's made possible thanks to an object. It's a cube here that I've added, just a simple cube, and on this cube I've added a principal volume shader plugged into the volume output of my material, meaning that this cube is made out of fog, and this allows me to have volumetric lighting. If I remove this cube, you can see now that you don't have the volumetric lighting and you don't have also the atmosphere inside my scene. So this I've added. You can also add it to your scene and then add a simple principal volume node here. I haven't changed any settings but the density. At the beginning I think it starts with 1. Okay, so it's like that, and you can have that much fun, but if it's really the case in this scene, I mean, we don't see anything, okay? So that will just be not that great for the project. So let's set it back to where it was. And so this is the settings you will pump up if you want this to be nicer. Like maybe I could set it up to something a bit higher. And then transparent is about also what we used in our glass shader. If I am to go and select our class objects, let's say for example the potion bottles. Remember we used here a transparent BSDF to simulate the caustics. So this is what this setting is about. It makes all the shaders using this transparent BSDF looking better. Okay, so that you can change. And again, do not choose values that are excessively high unless you got the most powerful computer in the world. Just tweak it like one value at a time or two max and see if that doesn't crash your computer or if your computer can handle the rendering. Okay, so the next tab then, it's here, the output properties. We've got here an output format. I'm using a 1080p format, and then you've got a percentage value. This allows you to keep the same format ratio but to render at a lower resolution instead of having to change those, because like 25% of 1080p, okay, I can find out it's 270, but this will be a bit more complicated, so it's better to have this at 100% if you want for your final render, or if it's for just a test, you can set it to 25%. Okay. Then you've got the frame rate. For an animation here in Europe, it's 24 frames per second, so that's okay. And then the range, okay, it's set up here. It's the same than what we have over here. The step is about rendering one image every frame. If I choose a step of 5, it will render an image every 5 frames. Okay, so let's leave it to 1. And then the time stretching is like, let's say I have an animation going from 0 to 100. If I want the animation to span across 200 frames, I can choose here in the new 200. And this will just make the animation play twice as slow as the rate we had before. I would not recommend to change that, because then you will mess up with your entire animation. Okay? And of course, at the end, you've got the output. The output, you can choose a folder for your outputs. Okay? I'll leave it here like this because that's the default and I usually use that. Okay? And then you've got the most important options, which are the file format. By default, I think it is set to PNG. Okay, and this will render, if you render an animation, it will render one image per frame. Okay, and that's what we should use when we render a complex animation. Why is that? This is because if we use the other option for just one entire video that I choose is FFmpeg videos, and I choose then, you've got a preset here called H264 in MP4. That's what I use mostly, and then I use here 12 and 2, but that's just personal preferences, let's say. Okay, so it's better to use an image sequence, because if I want to render as a video and my rendering crash in the middle, I have lost it all. Okay, and sometimes the rendering process can take up to hours, days, or weeks. You don't want weeks of work to just stop like that because your computer crashed or anything happened. Okay, so if you render as an image sequence using PNG for example, you can resume your rendering process. If you uncheck overwrite, this means that the render will resume where it stopped. So if you have 100 frames animation and it crashed at frame, let's say 40, it will just start rendering again the frame 41. And then, once you've got all this image sequence, I will show you, maybe in the next tutorial, how to put back together all this image sequence into one final animation. Of course, if you are short on disk space, you can use, instead of PNG, you can choose OpenEXR and choose the codec DWAA. Okay? This, in terms of quality, is similar to a PNG file, but in terms of size, I found that it's like maybe, let's say, 100 times lighter. So that could be a good option. Okay? So this way you will render an image sequence. Okay? And what you have, it is checked on by default at the beginning. So I have checked this off because I wanted to, but this is usually checked on, the compositing and the sequencer checkbox. Compositing means that it will composite your render or your image sequence after the rendering process, and the sequencer, this, if it is on, it will render what the sequencer sees. So the sequencer we'll use in the next tutorial, and the compositing, I'm gonna show you quickly how to use it and what it does. So this is a simple scene. I have here a cube with a camera, okay, and I'm in render mode using cycles and a GPU compute. The camera view is like that. Compositing process, you can use here the tab compositing to have it already set up like that. Okay, but me, I like to set up my own windows, so that's what I'm gonna do. I like to have here a compositor view, okay, and above an image editor set to viewer node. Okay, so at the moment, when you start compositing, it's like that. Okay, and usually you don't have anything in here. This is the render layer, so you need to have rendered your image at least once to have something. So I've already done a render, so that's why I have an image here. And the compositor works almost like the shader editor. You've got nodes, so an input node, which is my rendered image here, and an output node, which is the final result of the compositor. And you can then add nodes using the add menu here, or using Shift A on your keyboard. I'm gonna show you a simple trick. Okay, so in the color section, I can use, for example, exposure and set it in here. Okay, and as we did for the shader node, we can use on our keyboard Ctrl Shift and left click this node to have a viewer output. This viewer output is what I have set up in here. So here on the left, I see my render, and I can have it looking exactly like that. And here on top, I see the results of my compositing. Okay, so now if I change the exposure value, you can see that is changing my results. This is compositing. Okay, for the final result of the project, we're going to use a few of these nodes. What is great with this setting is that you can still go into the color management section and choose the false color option, and this will still display how bright or dark your image is. Okay, if you set this to 0, meaning you don't change the exposure, you can see it's still the same as the original image, but then you can set this up so that you can see if it's not too bright or not too dark either. Okay, now let's go back to here. I have already my node set up like here. Okay, and in fact, let's use sequence 1 instead of sequence 7. Okay, so let's do a render image. Now I have my image displayed here. Okay, if I want this to be displayed in the background, I can click backdrop here, and now it is displayed as well. I think it's the V or Alt V key to zoom in or out, and if I hold Alt on my keyboard, I can move the image, okay, with my middle mouse button. Okay, so that's the start of my compositing process. I have this single image and all the nodes I'm using are here. Okay, maybe this is just a bit too small. I'm gonna use this, the viewer node here, okay, and not the backdrop so that I can see better the results. Okay, so you can see here, if I mute this node using the M key on my keyboard, you can see I've added a bit of brightness contrast to make the brighter area a bit brighter and darker area a bit darker. This is good because this will separate our subject, here the book stand, from our background a bit better. Then I have a color curve, so let's see what it does as well. Okay, it's very subtle. You can see the image is a bit reddish. Okay, when it's activated, all of this can stay as subtle as we want. Then I have a color balance node. Okay, and this as well, you can see this is using the ISC CDL correction format. Okay, that's what I would recommend you to use as well. And then you've got here offset, power, and slope parameter. This is like changing the color tint of the dark areas, the middle range areas, and this is the brightest areas. Then I have a glare node. The glare node will make the bright area of my image glow a bit. And then you've got finally what is called a lens distortion. If I increase the distort parameter, you can see that in the outside of my view, okay, this is stretched as if we were using like a fish eye lens, okay, and the dispersion parameter will just separate the three color components, red, green, blue, again on the edges of the image or where it is most contrasty, over here, 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 and here. So this effect has, of course, to be very, very subtle, and the fit option will just prevent your image from just not being visible on the side. And that's all the nodes I'm using for my compositing. And of course, this will have to be adjusted per sequence. Okay, I have the feeling it was a bit of a mess, but let's say it's alright. I invite you to ask me any question you want in the comments, as usual, if you are a bit lost. But don't worry, just focus on having a sequence finished with the object, the camera movement, the lighting. And once you've got that, now you know how to render. Okay, setting up an output size, percentage at 100%, baking the simulations if needed. Then changing here your settings and the light path as well you can set, okay, for the max bounces. And then choosing an image sequence as an output, okay, and not a video yet. I'm gonna show you how to put it all back together in the next lesson, and maybe with other sequences done as well. I have to work on that. So hopefully this was clear enough for everyone. I wish you a very good day, week, and life as usual. I'll see you next time. Bye everyone.